Chapter 1. The Child of the Threshold. The storm had taken Thomas 3 hours before anyone noticed he was gone. Isolde discovered his absence when thunder shook the cottage windows and rain drummed against the thatch like skeletal fingers. His bed lay empty, sheets twisted as though he'd thrashed in some fevered dream, before rising to walk toward the woods. The Black Veil Woods, as the villagers called them, though Thomas was only 9 and spoke of them with the casual wonder of a child who hadn't yet learned what fear looked like. She should have been watching him. That thought would haunt her for the rest of her mortal life. The search began at dusk. The blacksmith, the vicar, 3 farmhands, all hollow-eyed and grim-lipped as they lit torches that the rain immediately extinguished. Isolde followed with a lantern held so tight her fingers went numb, calling Thomas's name until her voice fractured into something unrecognizable. The forest swallowed each cry. The trees were ancient here, their bark dark as bruises, their branches interlocking overhead to form a canopy so dense that even in daylight, the Black Veil remained twilight. By midnight, they'd called off the search. "The boy is lost," old Taverner had said, his voice the color of ash. "If he went deep, if he's fallen." Isolde hadn't heard the rest. She'd walked back to the cottage alone, soaked through, her body moving like something animated by will rather than life. Thomas wasn't dead. She would have felt it, some fracture in the world, some rupture in the cord that bound her to her brother. It remained whole, taut, tugging somewhere out in that darkness. She waited through the night. At 3 in the morning, when the rain had gentled to a mist and the moon emerged like a pale eye opening, she heard the sound of boots on wet earth. Isolde's heart seized. She rushed to the door, lantern raised, ready to see her brother stumbling from the trees, muddy and shivering and alive. The figure that emerged from the Black Veil was not Thomas. He was tall, impossibly tall, his shoulders broad enough to eclipse the moonlight. His clothes were drenched, clinging to a frame that seemed carved from shadow itself. Dark hair plastered to a face of such severe, unearthly beauty that Isolde's breath caught somewhere between her lungs and her throat. His eyes were the color of storm-dark water, and they fixed upon her with an intensity that felt like being seen for the first time in her life. But it was the child in his arms that stole her ability to think. Thomas hung against the stranger's chest like a sleeping angel, his small hand curled against a throat where Isolde could see impossibly no bite marks, no blood, no wound. The man's coat shielded him from the worst of the night, and as Isolde watched, the stranger's gaze softened almost imperceptibly as it fell upon the sleeping boy. "He wandered deep," the man said. His voice was like velvet scraped over stone, beautiful and wrong, where the paths bend, where the old thresholds still stand. He paused, and something flickered across his face like lightning behind cloud. "I found him weeping at the mirror stones." Mirror stones. Isolde had heard the old stories, fragments her grandmother had whispered about the sacred places where the veil between worlds grew thin, places where reality fractured and reformed. No one went there. No one had gone there for 100 years. "Thank you," she breathed, stepping forward to reach for her brother. The stranger didn't move away, but neither did he advance. He remained balanced at the threshold between forest and cottage, between the mist and the lamplight, as though uncertain which world he belonged to. When his eyes met hers, Isolde felt something deep in her chest recognize something deep in his. "I cannot stay," he said quietly. "The night is almost over. He is unharmed, but—" He hesitated, and the hesitation cost him something. She could see it in the tightening of his jaw. "He carries the echo of the threshold in his blood now. The mirror stones call to such children. It will fade, but for a time." His gaze locked on hers, and the intensity of it burned. "For a time, he will be sensitive to the thinning places. Keep him away from running water at midnight. Keep him from places where shadows gather too densely. And tell him," the words seemed wrenched from somewhere deep, somewhere sacred. "Tell him the shadow that wore the mask of stone means him no harm." "Who are you?" The question escaped before Isolde could swallow it. The stranger's expression shuddered, and for a moment she saw something vast and old and unutterably lonely flicker behind his eyes. He transferred Thomas carefully, reverently, into her arms. The boy barely stirred, murmuring something that might have been her name. "Someone who remembers what it is to have a sister," the man said softly. "Someone who cannot afford to be seen near a village twice. Someone cursed to forget, and to remember again, and to repeat this torment forever." He stepped back, and the mist seemed to gather around him like a living thing. "Keep your brother safe, Isolde Ashford, And if he calls for the shadow in dreams, do not be afraid. Some bonds are written in older languages than blood. Wait, how do you know my— But he was gone, not running, simply absent, as though he'd been erased from the frame of the world. The mist rolled where he'd stood, carrying nothing but the faint, impossible scent of winter roses, and something deeper, something like iron and earth and midnight itself. Isolde stumbled backward into the cottage, Thomas heavy and warm in her arms. She set him on the cot, checked every inch of him with trembling hands. No marks, no blood, nothing but the scent of him, mud, fear, sweat, and beneath it, something crystalline and ancient that she couldn't name. His eyes opened as she drew the blanket to his chin. Isolde, he whispered. I saw him in the mirrors, the prince in the mirrors. He was so sad, so sad. His eyes closed again, but he kept me safe. She sat beside him through the rest of the night, her heart thundering against her ribs, knowing with absolute certainty that her life had just cracked open along some fundamental fault line. The man in the mist had left something behind, not in Thomas. Though he carried the shadow's echo, he had left it in her. And worse, she was beginning to understand that she would never be able to refuse it. Chapter 2. The Dark Pull. The dreams began on the third night. Isolde woke gasping, her nightgown soaked through with perspiration despite the October chill that fingered through the cottage's single window. In the darkness, she could still feel the sensation of falling not downward, but inward, through layers of silk and shadow, into chambers lit by candlelight that cast no warmth. She'd seen him in those chambers, the prince in the mirrors. Every dream followed the same trajectory. She'd find herself standing in a vast hall lined with silver-backed glass. In each reflection, a different scene played out. A throne room, where a young man sat crowned in gold and sorrow. A battlefield where bodies fell like autumn leaves. A chamber where he knelt before an altar carved from bone, his hands bleeding into a chalice. And in all of them, his eyes found hers, not with surprise, but with the devastating recognition of someone who'd been waiting centuries for a face to finally match the one he'd loved in death. He never spoke in the dreams. He only looked at her, and the looking was its own kind of language. On the sixth night, Thomas woke screaming. Isolde ran to him, finding her brother tangled in sweat-dampened sheets, his eyes wide and unseeing. The mirrors, he sobbed into her nightgown. He's calling from the mirrors. He's so cold, Isolde. He's been cold for so long. She held him until he stilled, but the damage was done. The barrier between her own tormented sleep and Thomas's terror had become permeable. Whatever the stranger had left behind, whatever echo of the threshold stones lingered in her brother's blood, was now bleeding into hers. By day, Isolde functioned. She tended the garden, mended Thomas's clothes, sold her embroidery to the village seamstress, but each sunset brought a creeping dread, a hunger that had nothing to do with appetite. Her skin felt too tight. Her blood moved too slowly through her veins. She found herself drawn to the mirror in her room at dusk, standing before it with her heart hammering, half expecting to see him standing behind her. She never did. But sometimes, she could swear the glass rippled like water. It was on the 10th night that she finally understood. She'd fallen asleep by the hearth while mending, the needle still threaded in her lap. The transition into dream came like crossing a threshold of water. One moment the cottage's familiar shadows. The next, she stood in a hall that was not quite real, and yet more solid than anything waking had ever felt. The mirrors rose before her, infinite and gleaming, and in each one, he stood closer than the last. This time, he wore a shirt of deep crimson silk, the collar open to reveal a throat marked with scars, in patterns that hurt to look at, not because they were ugly, but because they spoke of ritual, of ceremony, of blood offered for reasons she couldn't comprehend. His black hair fell to his shoulders. His face, which had seemed aristocratic in moonlight, now revealed itself as something fiercer. A predator's face, beautiful the way a wolf was beautiful, the way death itself might be beautiful if you were brave enough to truly see it. "You come willingly now," he said. His voice carried the weight of that velvet and stone quality. But here in the mirror chamber, it resonated through her bones. "The threshold recognizes you." Isolde tried to step backward, but her feet wouldn't obey. "What are you doing to me?" "Nothing you do not wish me to do." He moved closer, and the mirrors around them flickered, her room appearing in some, the forest in others, a chamber of stone and candlelight in still more. "You carry the echo now, as your brother does. The mirror stones marked you the moment you received him from my arms. They know your blood." "My blood?" The word came out thin, frightened. He stopped a breath away from her. In this space between waking and dreaming, She could smell him clearly, not the winter roses and midnight she'd caught in the cottage doorway, but something rawer. Petrichor and copper and the green scent of tombs opened after centuries of sealing. Underneath it all, something warm. Something that called to something ancient and hidden in her own marrow. "You descend from the Ashford line," he said softly. "Old blood. Blood that once made treaties with my kind, when such treaties were possible. Blood that remembers the old languages." His hand reached toward her face, and she forced herself not to flinch. His fingers were cold, not the cold of the living, but the cold of something that had never truly been warm. "Your grandmother knew. She bound you to the threshold without telling you. A protection, I think. Or perhaps a promise. I don't understand." "I know." There was something almost tender in the way he said it, and that tenderness was worse than any threat could have been. "But you will. When the new moon rises 3 nights hence you must come to the forest, to the mirror stones. Bring nothing but yourself. Speak to no one of this. And if I don't?" Something flickered across his face like pain. "Then I will continue to haunt your dreams until one of us goes mad, and I am afraid, Isolde Ashford, that I have already spent more than my share of centuries in madness." He stepped closer, and she felt his fingers brush her cheekbone with a touch that felt like frostbite and fire simultaneously. "Come to me. Let me show you what I am, what we might be, if you are brave enough to bear it." "You're a monster," she whispered. But even as the words left her mouth, she knew them for a lie. He was something far more dangerous than a monster. He was lonely. Centuries of loneliness had carved him into a shape that called to something equally lonely in her own heart. "Yes," he agreed, and there was no self-pity in his voice, only acknowledgement. "But I am a monster that cannot bear another day of this particular torment. The threshold stones sang your name to me for 1,000 years before you were ever born, Isolde. Do you understand what that means? Do you understand what it costs me to stand before you in dreams or otherwise, and feel every ancient law forbidding me to touch you, and to want to touch you anyway?" The mirror chamber began to blur. She felt herself being pulled backward, toward waking. "The new moon," he called, and his voice followed her through layers of shadow. "Come to me." Isolde woke to find her hands pressed against the hearth mirror, her palms leaving prints of moisture on the glass. Outside, the night had grown truly dark, the kind of darkness that happened when even the stars seemed afraid to shine. She had 3 nights to decide whether she was braver than she was wise. She had a terrible feeling she already knew the answer. Chapter 3. The Immortal Stranger. The new moon hung invisible in the October sky. Isolde had spent the 3 intervening nights in a state of suspended animation, moving through her days as though her body were inhabited by someone else's will. She'd prepared Thomas's meals, mended his stockings, smiled when the village women inquired after her health. All the while, something beneath her skin thrummed with anticipation and dread in equal measure. She hadn't told Thomas where she was going. That small mercy, that small betrayal would haunt her later. The forest path was less a path than a scar through the undergrowth, lined with stones that seemed to pulse with a faint phosphorescence in the darkness. She'd never noticed them before, though she'd walked these woods her entire life. Perhaps they'd always been there, waiting. Perhaps she'd simply been blind to them until the threshold marked her. The mirror stones stood in a clearing that shouldn't have existed. She knew this forest. She'd explored it as a child, mapped its hollows and streams in her mind. Yet this place a perfect circle of ground, ringed by standing stones of black glass, their surfaces reflecting nothing but more darkness, had never appeared on any mental map she'd ever constructed. The stones were ancient beyond measure, their surfaces carved with symbols that seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. In the center of the circle, a figure waited. He wore black, not the practical black of the village doctor or the austere black of the clergy, but the black of velvet and shadow itself, garments that seemed to absorb the meager starlight rather than reflect it. His hair was unbound, falling like silk to his shoulders. When he turned to face her, the ambient darkness seemed to gather around him like courtiers around a throne, but it was his eyes that stopped her breath. They were no longer the storm-dark gray of their first meeting, or the haunted silver of the dream chamber. They were black, utterly and completely black, with no iris, no pupil, no white. As she watched, a thin ring of crimson appeared at the edge of each, like blood pooling beneath the surface of obsidian. "You came," he said, and his voice held such gratitude and such danger that Isolde felt her knees weaken. "I was afraid after so long. I've learned that humans are creatures of survival. Fear usually wins." "Who are you?" she asked, though she already knew. Some part of her had always known. What are you? He moved toward her, and she noticed for the first time that he cast no shadow. The starlight passed through him, as though he were only half present in this world. My name, in the language of the living, is Cassius. Once, it meant empty or vain, a prophecy my parents didn't recognize until it was far too late. He paused at the edge of the mirror stone circle, not crossing into it. I was a prince of Thrace, 734 years ago. I had a kingdom, a sister, a betrothed I loved more than my own life. I had everything a man might want, and I threw it all away in a single night of blood and madness. Isolde's throat had gone dry. How? The same way that princes throw away their lives throughout history, through pride, through love, through the arrogance of believing myself above the laws that govern mortality. He looked away toward the forest, and the pain that crossed his face was so acute, it seemed to age him centuries in an instant. There was a ritual, ancient magic, older than Christianity, older than Rome itself, a ceremony to bind my soul to my sisters, so that we might never be separated, even by death. We were very close, you understand, closer than propriety allowed. He paused, and there was a weight in that pause. She died anyway. A fever took her in 3 days. The ritual failed, and the failure. He turned back to Isolde, and she saw that his eyes had returned to gray, though tears actual, physical tears traced silver lines down his cheekbones. The failure cursed me. The magic that was meant to bind us to eternity instead bound me to hunger, to this form, to this particular torment of consciousness without end. The blood, Isolde whispered. Yes. The blood is all that keeps me anchored to the world. Without it, I become something incorporeal, a shade trapped between mirrors, a hunger with no body to contain it. With it, I am this. He gestured to himself with something like disgust. Neither living nor dead, forever burning with thirst that can never truly be sated. His gaze found hers again, and in it she saw the weight of centuries. Do you begin to understand why the threshold marked you? Why the mirror stones sang your name through the long darkness? Isolde's legs carried her forward despite her mind's frantic warnings. You're going to kill me. No. He said it with absolute certainty. I am going to do something far worse. I am going to make you complicit in my survival, and then I am going to spend eternity wondering if the cost to you was worth the selfish, desperate need to not be alone anymore. She was close enough now to see the fine tremor in his hands, close enough to smell that cocktail of scents again, winter and tombs, and something green and growing, close enough to see that beneath the dark exterior, there lived something terrifyingly, devastatingly human. Why? She asked. Why me? Why not simply, she couldn't finish. Couldn't say kill yourself to this creature, who'd already endured 7 centuries of slow torture. Because, he said softly, the mirror stones don't lie, and they have shown me, across every reflection, every threshold, every thin place between this world and the next, that you are the only soul I've encountered in 700 years that the blood remembers, that my curse recognizes and calls to. He reached out, and this time he did cross into the circle. His hand was impossibly gentle when it touched her cheek. Your bloodline was bound to mine centuries before you were born. A debt? Perhaps. A promise. Or perhaps simply the cruelty of a universe that enjoys watching 2 lonely things recognize each other, only to face the impossible choice between love and survival. What choice? Isolde's voice was barely a whisper. Cassius stepped closer, and she could feel the cold radiating from him like winter itself. You could leave now. Walk back to your cottage, to your brother, to the safety of your mortal life. Forget me. The threshold will fade from your blood eventually. Thomas will forget. You will grow old, and I will remain as I am, hungry and alone in the mirrors. Or, he breathed, and his fangs descended slowly, deliberately, like a door opening onto darkness. You could let me taste the blood that's been singing to me since before your birth. You could understand what we might become to each other. You could choose this damnation with full knowledge of what it costs. Isolde didn't think. If she thought, she would run. Instead, she tilted her head, exposing the pale column of her throat. Show me, she whispered. And Cassius, the cursed prince of Thrace, the lonely god of mirrors, the monster who'd waited 734 years for this moment, bent his head and changed everything. Chapter 4. The First Blood. The moment his fangs pierced her skin, the world inverted. It wasn't pain, though. There was pain. A bright silver shock that lanced through her throat and down into her chest. It was something beyond pain. A recognition so profound that Isolde gasped. her fingers clutching at the velvet of his coat, as though she might drown if she let go. His mouth was impossibly cold against her neck, and yet everywhere his lips touched, her blood burned. She felt it leaving her body in waves, drawn upward through her veins as though summoned by some ancient song buried in her marrow. With each pull, with each rhythmic draw of his feeding, images fractured through her mind like shards of mirror reflecting scenes she'd never lived. A woman with her father's eyes, standing in a sunlit courtyard of white marble, the woman's hand on a young man's chest, a young man with Cassius's exact features before the centuries had carved him hollow. That same courtyard, now drenched in blood, bodies everywhere, and Cassius, young Cassius, still wearing the remnants of royal finery, kneeling over his sister's corpse, screaming in a language that predated words. An altar of bone, candles burning with blue flame, ancient words spoken in a voice that cracked with desperation, and the magic taking hold, the curse crystallizing like ice around his soul, binding him to hunger and shadow and eternal, exquisite torment. 700 years compressed into seconds, centuries of feeding in darkness, of learning that mortal blood sustained him but never satisfied him, of watching empires rise and fall from the vantage of mirrors, of seeing her always her reflected in the faces of 1,000 different women, none of them quite right, none of them quite enough, until now. Isolde's knees buckled, but Cassius caught her, his free hand splaying across her lower back to hold her against him. She could feel him trembling. The mighty cursed prince who'd endured 7 centuries of isolation was trembling against her. The feeding seemed to go on forever and end in an instant. Time had become meaningless. Reality had become negotiable. She existed only in the sensation of him, the cold of his mouth, the impossible warmth of her own blood as it flowed into him. The way her heartbeat seemed to synchronize with something vast and ancient that lived beneath his sternum. Finally, with what seemed like tremendous effort, Cassius pulled away. Isolde caught a glimpse of her own blood on his lips, such a small amount, barely visible before he released her entirely and stepped back. She swayed, and he reached out to steady her, his hands careful, almost reverent. "Sit," he commanded, his voice rough with something that might have been hunger or might have been emotion. "Before you fall." She sank onto one of the mirror stones, which was warm beneath her despite the October chill. Her hand flew to her neck, finding 2 small punctures already beginning to close. The bleeding had nearly stopped. "What?" Her voice came out fractured. "What just happened?" Cassius stood at the edge of the circle, his back to her, his entire frame rigid with tension. When he finally turned, his eyes had returned to that unnerving black and crimson, and there was a line of her blood traced along his lower lip that he made no move to wipe away. "You carry the old blood," he said, each word precisely enunciated, as though he were speaking a language he'd almost forgotten. "The Ashford line. Your grandmother wasn't simply bound to the threshold, Isolde. She was descended from the line of priestesses who performed the ritual that cursed me." He paused, and something like wonder flickered across his face. "I can feel it in you, the echo of their magic, the way their words are carved into your very cells. Is that," Isolde swallowed hard, "is that why I called to you?" "No, yes, it's complicated." He sank onto a stone opposite hers, suddenly looking as exhausted as though he'd just run 100 miles. "The ritual that cursed me was meant to be performed with willing blood. Bloodline blood. My sister and we were attempting to create an eternal bond, but the magic was corrupted somehow, twisted by grief and desperation. Instead of binding us together across death, it bound me to hunger itself, to an endless, insatiable thirst for blood, particularly blood with the signature of my own lineage." He looked at her directly, and she saw the anguish behind those terrible eyes. "For centuries, I couldn't even touch one of my own bloodline without nearly losing all control. The hunger became something separate from my will, something that wanted to consume. And now?" Isolde asked softly. "Now." He extended his hand, and she watched as his fingers trembled. "Your blood doesn't call to the hunger. It calls to something else, something that's been dormant in me for so long I'd nearly forgotten it existed. It calls to the part of me that's still human, the part that still remembers what it felt like to love someone without the shadow of predation." He looked away. "The part that recognizes its mirror in you." Isolde rose on unsteady legs and walked to him. She took his hand, his impossibly cold hand, and placed it against her heart. Beneath her palm, she could feel his own heartbeat, or what remained of it. A slow, distant echo, like a drum struck once every few seconds. "Show me more," she said. "Isolde, I don't think, not like that." She lifted her other hand and pressed it to his chest. "Show me what you saw. When you drank. I saw your memories, your sister, the ritual. Show me that again. All of it." Cassius's eyes widened. That shouldn't be possible. The blood bond doesn't work. Shouldn't, is what humans say when they don't understand the old magic. Isolde interrupted, surprised by the certainty in her own voice. "My grandmother knew what I was. She must have prepared me somehow. Show me, Cassius. Let me understand what you are, what we are." For a long moment, he didn't move. Then, slowly, he leaned forward and pressed his forehead to hers. His cold breath mingled with her warm exhalation. "This will hurt," he whispered. "Seeing through my eyes, remembering my pain, it will change you." "I'm already changed," Isolde said. "I changed the moment you came out of the forest with my brother sleeping in your arms." She felt his lips curve against her forehead. Was it a smile? And then the world shifted again. This time, there was no feeding. Instead, there was connection, a tunnel of consciousness opening between them. And through it, she experienced his entire existence in terrible, crystalline detail. 700 years of hunger and loneliness. 700 years of watching the world transform from stone to iron to steel, watching civilizations rise and crumble, watching humanity learn and forget and learn again, all while remaining trapped in the same cursed flesh. She experienced his sister's death, the ritual, the moment the curse took hold and transformed a desperate prayer into a sentence of eternal isolation. She saw the mirror stones and understood their purpose. They weren't a prison, but a tether, a way for something so fundamentally broken to remain connected to the world at all. And at the very end of that tunnel of memory, she saw herself, countless versions of herself, reflected across centuries, appearing in his visions like a promised salvation he'd never quite been able to reach. Until now, when the vision released her, Isolde was weeping. Chapter 5. The Unraveling Past. The cottage was different when Isolde returned. She hadn't consciously chosen to leave the mirror stones. The transition had been seamless, as though she'd simply blinked and found herself standing on the path back home, Cassius's presence still thrumming through her blood like a second heartbeat. Dawn was breaking, painting the forest in shades of bruised purple and gold. She should have been terrified. Instead, she felt split open, fundamentally altered, as though some crucial veil had been lifted from her perception of the world. Thomas was awake when she entered the cottage. He sat at the small table, methodically tearing bread into smaller and smaller pieces, his eyes distant and glassy. When he saw her, something flickered across his face. Recognition, yes, but also something older, something that didn't belong in the expression of a 9-year-old child. "You've been to him," Thomas said. It wasn't a question. Isolde's blood turned to ice. "Thomas, he showed me too," her brother continued, his small hands stilling on the bread. "In the dreams, he showed me the mirrors, and the ritual, and the sister who died." Thomas looked up at her, and his eyes held such ancient sorrow that she had to grip the edge of the table to steady herself. "He showed me what grandmother did." "What do you mean? What did grandmother do?" Thomas's voice dropped to a whisper. "She was one of them, Isolde. One of the priestesses. Not the ones who cursed him, no. Those were older, from before his time. But grandmother was descended from them. She knew what he was, and she knew what we carried in our blood." He picked up the bread again, his fingers methodical, almost ritualistic. "The threshold stones recognized us because grandmother bound us to them. Before she died, she made an oath. She promised that when the time was right, when a girl child was born with the old blood flowing true, she would come to the mirror stones. She would meet him. She would understand." Isolde sank into the chair across from him. "How do you know this?" "Because I saw it," Thomas said simply, "when he drank from me that first night in the forest. Not much, just enough to understand what I carried. Just enough to know that I'm not the one he was waiting for." He looked at her directly, and the weight of his gaze was far too heavy for a child. "You are. You've always been. Grandmother made sure of it." The room tilted. Isolde gripped the table edge, her mind racing backward through her entire life, searching for signs she'd somehow missed. The old chest in grandmother's room, that she was never allowed to open. The strange herbs grandmother had burned when Isolde was born, herbs that smelled of copper and ash. The way grandmother had held her as an infant, whispering words in a language that predated speech. "Why didn't she tell me?" Isolde whispered. "Because knowing would have broken you," a new voice said. Isolde spun to find an old woman standing in the cottage doorway. She was impossibly tall, her hair pure white, her eyes the color of storm clouds. She wore a dress of deep gray wool that seemed to absorb light, and around her neck hung a pendant of tarnished silver, a symbol that matched the carvings on the mirror stones. Grandmother, Isolde breathed. But it wasn't grandmother. It was grandmother, or rather, this woman wore grandmother's face as one might wear a mask, but the consciousness behind those eyes was far older, far stranger. When the woman smiled, Isolde saw fangs. Not the elegant fangs Cassius possessed, but something rawer, something that spoke of a hunger far more primal than even his centuries-old curse. I have worn many names, the woman said, stepping fully into the cottage and closing the door behind her with a soft click. I was priestess in Thrace, 700 years ago. I performed the ritual that bound that poor, desperate boy to eternity. I have been many things since protector, guardian, keeper of the old magic, and I have been something very close to grandmother to you, Isolde Ashford, watching from the shadows, waiting for the moment when your bloodline would call strongly enough to his. You're like him, Isolde said. You're a vampire. I am something older than your modern word allows for, the woman corrected gently. I was cursed long before Cassius, by different magic, for different sins. But yes, we are kin of a sort, creatures bound to the blood, bound to the darkness. She moved to the table and sat, her movements fluid and unsettling. Your grandmother, the mortal one, the one who raised you, was my vessel for the final decades of her life. I needed to be close to you. I needed to guide you through the bloodline's awakening. Thomas was eating his bread calmly, as though this revelation were perfectly ordinary. Which, Isolde realized with a shock of vertigo, perhaps it was for him. He'd already been shown these truths through Cassius's memories. What do you want from me? Isolde asked. Nothing you haven't already given, the old woman said. You went to the mirror stones. You accepted his hunger. You opened yourself to the blood bond. Her eyes gleamed with something that might have been approval or might have been hunger. The question now is what you want, Isolde, because the choice before you is no longer simple. What choice? Cassius is bound by the curse to hunger, yes, but the curse has limits. It can be broken, or at least, rewritten. The woman leaned forward. The ritual that bound him to his sister's death created a wound in the fabric of things, a wound that has been bleeding shadow for 7 centuries. That wound could be healed, but only with willing blood, true blood, lineage blood, the blood of someone connected to the original curse. You mean my blood, Isolde said flatly. Yes. If you undergo the counter-ritual, if you allow me to use your blood to unbind what was bound so desperately all those centuries ago, Cassius could be freed. He could live as humans live. He could age, could die, could finally rest. The woman's expression was almost gentle. Or you could refuse. You could let him continue as he is cursed, hungry, immortal, but no longer alone. Bound to you instead of to hunger. 2 souls recognizing each other across the darkness. That's not a choice, Isolde whispered. That's a trap. Either way, I lose him. Either way, you save him, the woman corrected. The question is only whether you save him by freeing him from his curse, or by becoming his eternity. Behind her words, Isolde heard it, the vast machinery of fate grinding forward, the mirror stones singing their old, old song. She thought of Cassius's eyes, black and crimson with hunger and loneliness. She thought of the way her blood had felt leaving her body, the way his desperation had seemed to ease, just slightly, as though her offering had eased a pain he'd carried for 700 years. I need to see him again, Isolde said, before I choose. The old woman smiled, and this time there was no hiding the fangs. Of course, the new moon is 3 nights hence. But I warn you, child, choose quickly. The threshold stones are growing restless. They've been waiting a long time for this convergence, and the old magic doesn't like to be kept waiting. She stood, and in the morning, light flooding through the cottage window, she seemed to fade, becoming translucent, until finally she was gone entirely, leaving only the faint scent of ancient earth and blood. Thomas returned to his bread, humming something that sounded like a lullaby, and Isolde sat at the table, her heart beating out a rhythm that was no longer entirely her own, knowing that whatever came next, whatever choice she made, there was no returning to the life she'd lived before the mirror stones sang her name. Chapter 6. Revelation of Darkness. Cassius knew she would come. He waited in the underground sanctum, a chamber carved from living stone centuries before Christianity had given England its name. A place so old that the very rock seemed to remember the rituals performed within its walls. Candles burned with blue flame, casting shadows that moved independent of any light source. The walls were lined with mirrors, each one reflecting a different iteration of the chamber, each one containing a different version of Cassius, younger, older, more human, more monstrous. In the central mirror hung the portrait. It was enormous, painted on silk so fine it was nearly translucent. It depicted a young woman with Isolde's exact features, wearing the robes of an ancient priestess. Her hands were stained with blood, and her eyes held the same terrible knowing that Isolde's had begun to acquire. The painting was dated in Latin script at the bottom. Thessia, Thracia, Anno Domini 1293. That's not possible, Isolde said from the chamber's entrance. That was 700 years ago. Cassius turned to face her, and in the candlelight, his true nature became impossible to deny or diminish. His skin held an almost translucent quality, as though he were gradually becoming something made of glass and shadow. The veins beneath his surface traced patterns of deepest blue, not the blue of living blood, but the blue of something far older, something that predated human biology. Your bloodline has been returning, he said quietly. Over and over, different names, different lives, but always the same soul, drawn back through the mirror stones again and again. The painting was done by a witch who could see across time. She was trying to warn me, trying to tell me that the bond your ancestor created, the one that helped curse me, would eventually provide the key to my redemption. Isolde stepped further into the chamber, and the mirrors reflected her movement endlessly, creating the illusion of infinite Isoldes walking through infinite versions of this sacred place. The woman who wore grandmother's face told me about the counter ritual. She said I could free you from the curse. Yes. Cassius's voice was heavy with centuries of longing and fresh, newly sharpened despair. She is Morvenna, the first priestess who bound me. She's kept watch all these years, waiting for your bloodline to ripen to full power. The counter-ritual would require your willing sacrifice. Your blood, spilled at the exact moment of the new moon, mixed with mine in a ceremony that would reverse the original binding. He paused, and she saw him struggle with something internal, some vast hunger fighting against conscience. It would free me, Isolde. I would age. I would eventually die. I would finally be released. But, she prompted, because there was clearly more. But it would also cost you. He moved toward her, and she noticed that he cast no reflection in any of the mirrors surrounding them. The magic that would unbind me would bind itself to you instead. You would carry the curse's echo. You would live longer than you should. You would crave blood in ways you can't imagine. You would become something neither human nor vampire. A husk, a walking wound, a sacrifice made permanent. Morvenna didn't mention that, Isolde said softly. Morvenna doesn't care. She's tired of carrying the weight of her ancient sin. She wants absolution, and she's willing to use you as the price. Cassius stopped, just out of arm's reach, his black eyes gleaming with something that looked like tears. I will not allow it, Isolde. I would rather remain cursed until the end of time than watch you destroyed to satisfy an old priestess's need for redemption. Then what? Isolde moved closer, drawn to him as though by invisible threads. What happens if I refuse the counter-ritual? What happens to us? We can choose the other path. His hand reached toward her face, and this time he didn't stop himself from touching her. His fingers traced her cheekbone, leaving trails of ice in their wake. We can bind ourselves to each other instead of to the curse. It's an older magic, older than the ritual that cursed me. It requires willing blood and willing souls. But if we perform it correctly, it would create something new, something that's never been done before. A blood bond, Isolde whispered, understanding blooming in her mind like night blooming flowers. Yes, but not the kind you're imagining, not a simple exchange of vitality. This would be a true binding soul to soul, heartbeat to heartbeat. You would share my consciousness. I would share your mortality, my experience tempered by your brief, precious humanity. We would become something singular, something that exists in both the mirror realm and the waking world simultaneously. He paused, and the vulnerability in his voice was almost unbearable. You would essentially be consigning yourself to a half-life, Isolde, neither fully living nor truly dead, forever bound to me. Is that what you want? She asked. What I want is irrelevant. What matters is what you— The chamber shuddered. The candles flared suddenly, their blue flame turning sickly green. The mirrors cracked not with sound, but with a deep, resonant hum that seemed to come from the earth itself. And in the central mirror, the portrait of Thessia began to move. Her painted lips opened, and a voice like breaking glass issued forth. He lies to you, girl. the portrait's eyes fixed on Isolde with malevolent intensity. The blood bond would enslave you far more completely than the counter-ritual ever could. You would exist in his dreams. You would hunger as he hungers. You would spend eternity as his shadow, his echo, his prisoner dressed up as his beloved. Morvenna, stop, Cassius commanded, but his voice held no authority. The priestess had clearly transcended whatever binding had previously contained her. The counter-ritual is mercy, Morvenna continued, and now her voice filled the entire chamber, emanating from every mirror simultaneously. The counter-ritual is freedom. For both of you, he would finally know rest, and you, Isolde Ashford, would live your natural lifespan and die, as humans are meant to, in peace, in completion, knowing that you saved a tortured soul from his eternal prison. The chamber began to collapse inward. The mirrors cracked with increasing violence, and through the cracks, Isolde could see something moving, something vast and hungry and ancient, something that had been sealed behind the mirrors for centuries, waiting. Run, Cassius said, grabbing her hand. His flesh was ice, his grip desperate. The sanctum is failing. Morvenna's been waiting for the moment when you were here, when your blood bond to me was strong enough to, but there was nowhere to run. The chamber had become a maze of fracturing mirrors, each one reflecting not the sanctum but something else, a cathedral of bone, a throne room carved from shadow, a landscape of endless darkness, and stepping through the largest crack in the central mirror came a figure that made even Cassius recoil in horror. It wore the form of a woman, but it was wrapped in shadows that seemed to have weight and substance. Its eyes burned with an hunger that made Cassius's 700-year-old thirst look like a child's passing fancy. "Hello, little prince," the shadow woman said, and her voice was the sound of centuries of suffering given voice. "I've been waiting so very long to be free." Chapter 7. The Gothic Trial. Time fractured. One moment, Isolde stood in the collapsing sanctum, Cassius's ice-cold hand locked around hers. The next, she was standing in a cathedral of bone vast and impossible, its vaulted ceiling lost in darkness, its floor a checkerboard of white and black that seemed to extend infinitely in all directions. The walls were constructed entirely from skeletal remains, arranged in patterns that hurt to look at directly, each bone carved with symbols that predated language. Cassius released her hand, positioning himself between her and the shadow woman who had now emerged fully into this new space. His form flickered like a damaged mirror, one moment solid, the next translucent, as though he were struggling to maintain cohesion in this place. "Isolde, listen to me carefully," he said, his voice steady, despite the strain visible in every line of his body. "This place exists in the spaces between mirrors, in the spaces between heartbeats. What you're seeing isn't entirely real, but that doesn't make it harmless. Here, intention has substance. Fear has teeth." The shadow woman laughed, a sound like cathedral bells tolling in a funeral dirge. As she moved, her form became clearer, a woman in ancient priestess robes, her skin translucent as frosted glass, her eyes burning with an intelligence that predated human consciousness. When she smiled, Isolde saw something that wasn't quite teeth but something far more terrible. "I am Demiurge," the shadow woman said, her gaze fixed on Isolde with an intensity that felt like physical pressure. "I am what remains of the first ritual, not the curse itself, but the consciousness that was trapped within it when Morvenna and her sisters bound young Cassius to his eternal hunger. I have been screaming in the mirrors for 700 years, growing stronger with each feeding, each blood bond, each moment of desperation that fed my hunger." "What do you want?" Isolde asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "What I have always wanted," Demiurge replied, moving closer with movements that seemed to exist in multiple planes simultaneously. "Freedom, release, a body of my own. The ritual that cursed Cassius created a wound in the fabric of reality, and I have been pooling in that wound like water in a depression, growing, coalescing, waiting for the right moment to break free." Demiurge paused directly in front of Isolde, and she could smell something like burnt copper and old lightning emanating from the creature's form. "You are that moment, child. Your blood carries the signature of the original priestesses. Your willingness to accept Cassius's hunger has opened the door wider still. If you complete the counter-ritual with Morvenna's guidance, the binding will shatter entirely, and I will finally have what I need to manifest fully in your world." "Then I won't do it," Isolde said firmly. Demiurge's expression twisted into something that might have been rage or might have been amusement. "You don't understand your own powerlessness, do you? The choice was never truly yours. The moment you accepted Cassius's hunger, the moment you shared his blood, You became part of the ritual. You are a catalyst now, not an agent. Your consent is irrelevant. But Cassius moved, then a blur of motion that seemed to tear reality itself. He placed himself directly between Isolde and Demiurge, and for the first time, Isolde saw him truly transformed. His form expanded, becoming something vast and terrible and beautiful. Wings of shadow unfurled from his shoulders. His eyes blazed with an ancient light, and when he opened his mouth, she heard the voice of 700 years of accumulated power. "I am Cassius Thracia," he said, and the Cathedral of Bone shuddered at his words. "Prince of a kingdom that fell before your kingdom even rose. I was bound by priestesses, yes, but I was bound by their blood, their will, their consciousness. They created the wound, but I became the ward. I became the lock that kept you imprisoned, Demiurge, and I have held that lock for every single one of these 700 years. You're weakening," Demiurge hissed. "I can feel it. Each year, each century, you grow weaker. The hunger eats away at your strength. You cannot hold the ward forever." "No," Cassius agreed. "But I don't have to hold it forever. Only long enough." He turned to Isolde, and in his eyes she saw something crystallize a terrible, beautiful resolution. She understood what he meant to do before he moved. "Cassius, no," she began, but he was already reaching for her. His hand touched her forehead, and the Cathedral of Bone dissolved. They stood once more in the collapsed sanctum, but now it was different. The mirrors had shattered into dust, the blue candles had gone dark, and the stones themselves seemed to be crumbling into powder. But in the center of the destruction stood a figure of pure light, not Cassius, but something he was becoming, something he was choosing to become. "The binding," he said, and his voice carried the resonance of centuries. "I'm rewriting it. I'm pulling all of Demiurge's consciousness back into the mirror realm, back into the ward. But to do it, I need to anchor the ritual with something stronger than my own will." He looked at Isolde with eyes that held the full weight of 700 years of loneliness and love and desperate, aching need. "I need your death, Isolde," he whispered. The words hung in the air like poison, like prayer, like the most terrible question ever asked. "Not permanent," he continued quickly, his form flickering between solid and shadow. "A small death, a binding death. You would fall into sleep, into the mirror realm itself. Your consciousness would merge with the ward, would become one with the binding I've maintained all these years. You would exist in the threshold places, not alive, not dead, but eternal in a different way. And in exchange, Demiurge would be sealed forever. The curse would be transmuted, the wound would be closed. And you?" Isolde whispered. Cassius reached out and took her hand one final time. His flesh was no longer ice now, but something warmer, the temperature of twilight, of the space between day and night. "I would be free," he said. "Free from the hunger, free from the curse, free to become mortal again, to age, to die, to finally rest." He paused, and a tear traced down his cheek. "But I would lose you. You would become the threshold itself, and I would exist in the waking world, forever separate from the mirror realm where you dwell." "That's not a sacrifice," Isolde said softly. "That's torture." "Yes," Cassius agreed. "But it's the only path where you survive, where Demiurge is bound, where the curse is broken for good." Behind them, Demiurge's form was beginning to claw its way through the fractured mirrors once more. The creature's hunger was becoming visible now, a roiling darkness that consumed reality itself. "Choose," Cassius said. "Quickly, choose, and I will make it so." And Isolde, standing in the ruins of the ancient sanctum, with the shadows closing in, realized that she had never truly had any choice at all. From the moment the mirror stones sang her name, from the moment Cassius had emerged from the forest with her brother sleeping in his arms, her fate had been written in blood and bone and the old, old magic. She squeezed his hand and closed her eyes. "I choose," she whispered. "I choose you." Chapter 8. Blood and desire converge. The moment her eyes closed, Isolde fell, not downward, inward, through layers of consciousness that peeled away like the petals of a flower blooming in reverse. She felt Cassius's grip tighten on her hand, felt his ancient power beginning to surge through her veins like a tide of liquid starlight. The sanctum around them ceased to exist as a physical space, and became instead a tapestry of sensation. The weight of 700 years of solitude, the ache of forbidden hunger, the desperate, beautiful ache of a soul that had learned to love despite all the reasons not to. Demiurge's form lunged for her, but Cassius moved faster. He pulled Isolde close, and his kiss was not a lover's kiss, but a binding, a seal, a covenant, a prayer written in blood and saliva, and the ancient language that predated human speech. She felt her consciousness begin to fragment, to scatter across 1,000 mirrors, felt herself becoming something distributed and vast and terrifyingly interconnected. But she wasn't afraid. Instead, she opened herself to the transformation. Let Cassius's magic flood through her. Let his 700 years of accumulated power begin to rewrite her cellular structure into something that could exist in the threshold spaces. And in return, she gave him something he'd been starving for longer than she'd been alive. She gave him her mortality, not as a curse, but as a gift. She poured it into him, the fragility of human life, the preciousness of finite time, the way that every moment was rendered holy by virtue of being temporary. She showed him what it meant to be brief, to be ephemeral, to understand that everything beautiful was beautiful precisely because it would end. The sanctum exploded with light. It wasn't the blue flame of the candles or the green corruption of Morvena's ancient magic. It was pure, crystalline light, the color of dawn, breaking over a cemetery, the color of blood in candlelight, the color of a soul recognizing itself across the bridge of eternity. Demiurge's form shattered like a dropped mirror, each fragment of shadow immediately drawn backward, sucked into the recesses of the mirror realm, with a sound like the death rattle of something impossibly vast. The creature's final scream echoed across dimensions, a wail of hunger denied, of freedom stolen back into imprisonment, and then silence. Isolde's eyes opened, or rather, her consciousness opened, for she no longer possessed eyes in any conventional sense. She could see, but not through the mechanism of mortal biology. She could perceive the sanctum simultaneously from all angles, could see through every remaining shard of mirror, could perceive Cassius standing in the center of the chamber with his arms outstretched, his form beginning to solidify into something genuinely human. She watched as color returned to his skin. She watched as his eyes shifted from that terrible black and crimson back to the storm gray she'd fallen in love with. She watched as his form became denser, more real, anchored to the waking world in a way it hadn't been in 700 years. But she could no longer feel his hand in hers. The connection between them had transformed into something else, something that existed in the spaces between moments, in the fractional infinities between heartbeats. "Cassius," she called, trying to reach him across the new gulf that had opened between them. And miraculously, he heard. His head whipped around, and for a moment his eyes were unfocused, searching. Then they found her, or rather, they found the point in space where her consciousness resided, hovering like a ghost in the ruined sanctum. "Isolde?" His voice was different now, still carrying the weight of his centuries, but underneath it, something new, something that sounded like hope. "Are you? Can you?" "I'm here," she said, and found that she could project her voice through the mirrors, could make herself heard in the waking world through the fractures in reality she now inhabited. "I'm in the threshold. I can see you. I can feel you." Cassius staggered forward, his newly solid form moving with the uncertainty of someone relearning gravity. When he reached the central mirror, the one that had contained the portrait of Thesia, he pressed his palms against the glass. "I can feel you too," he whispered. "It's like you're beneath my skin, like I've swallowed starlight and it's spreading through my veins." He paused, and she felt the weight of his realization. "You're part of me now. Truly part of me." "Yes," Isolde confirmed. "And you're part of me." The binding is complete. They remained there in silence for a time that had no measurement, seconds or hours or years, time being meaningless in the threshold spaces. Isolde could perceive through every mirror in the chamber, could see Cassius's reflection multiplied infinitely in each fragmented surface. In some reflections, she appeared beside him, a translucent figure of light and shadow. In others, he appeared alone. In still others, they seemed to overlap, their forms merging and separating in an endless dance. "What happens now?" Cassius asked finally. "Now," Isolde said, and she began to move through the mirrors, through the chamber, around him in a spiral of conscious intention. "We learn what it means to be something new, something that has never existed before." She showed him, through their bond, what she perceived from the threshold, the way the world looked when viewed simultaneously from every angle, from every moment, from every mirror. She showed him the beauty in the in-between places, the sacred spaces where possibility was still undecided. She showed him that the threshold wasn't a prison, but a different kind of freedom. "I can walk in your world," she explained, and as she spoke, she felt herself beginning to coalesce into something more solid. A shadow took her form in the mirrors, a silhouette that became increasingly detailed. Not as I was, I'll always exist partially in the mirror realm now. But I can be with you. In the evenings, when the light is dim, in the moments between sleep and waking, in every reflection, in every threshold, Cassius reached for the mirror again, and this time, when his fingers touched the glass, they passed through it. His hand emerged on the other side, on her side, and Isolde found herself able to grasp it. The touch was strange, insubstantial as mist but burning with connection, with the reality of their binding. "I love you," he said, and the words seemed to reshape reality itself. "I have loved you across 700 years, through 1,000 mirrors, through the hunger and the darkness and the endless, aching solitude. I love you as a man loves a woman, as a prince loves his beloved, as a damned soul loves the grace that refuses to abandon it. And I love you," Isolde replied, and she pulled him forward until half his body had passed through the mirror, until he stood suspended in the threshold space beside her, existing in both worlds simultaneously, not despite what you are, but because of it, because you are broken and beautiful, and so desperately, achingly human, beneath all the centuries, and the hunger, and the shadow. They came together in an embrace that existed in both worlds at once. Where Cassius's solid flesh met Isolde's threshold form, reality seemed to shimmer. Light and shadow intertwined. The ancient magic of the binding sang through both their veins, and for the first time in 700 years, Cassius felt something like peace. But the peace was incomplete, because even as they held each other, suspended between worlds, they could feel something else stirring, a presence vast and dark and hungry that had been watching from the spaces beyond the mirrors. The binding had sealed Demiurge away, but not destroyed it, and in the deepest places of the mirror realm, something ancient and terrible was beginning to wake. Chapter 9. Covenant Acknowledged. 3 months passed in the waking world. To Isolde, time had become a different substance, malleable, negotiable, existing in multiple directions simultaneously. She experienced it through Cassius's perception when he walked in daylight, and through her own expanded awareness when she existed fully in the threshold spaces. Days blurred into nights, blurred into seasons, marked only by the changing quality of light in the mirrors and the shifting of Cassius's emotional landscape. He had returned to the village as a stranger. The cottage, her cottage, now served as a sanctuary where the boundary between worlds grew thin enough for them to meet with increasing solidity. Cassius had paid the village physician handsomely to examine Thomas, to confirm what they already knew. The boy carried no curse, no mark, only the fading echo of the threshold stones in his blood. Within months, even that would fade entirely. But Isolde would never fade. She existed now in a state of perpetual becoming, never quite solid enough to cast a permanent shadow, never quite insubstantial enough to fade completely. When Cassius held her, she could feel the weight of her own form, could taste the air with a tongue that was somehow both present and absent. When he released her, she dissolved back into the mirror realm, back into the vast interconnected network of reflective surfaces that had become her home and her prison and her salvation all at once. It was on a night when the autumn moon hung swollen and blood-red that Morvenna returned. She appeared not in the mirrors of the cottage, but in the stream that ran beside it, a place where water reflected the sky, where reality and reflection were already deeply confused. Isolde felt her presence first, a ripple in the threshold fabric, a disturbance in the spaces where consciousness pooled and gathered. "The ancient priestess comes," Isolde warned through the bond they shared. "I can feel her moving through the mirror realm." Cassius looked up from the book he'd been reading, a grimoire bound in leather and midnight, filled with symbols and incantations that belonged to neither his world nor hers. He set it aside with careful deliberation and rose from the chair by the hearth. "Let her come," he said quietly. This conversation was always going to happen. Morvenna emerged from the stream like something being born, her form coalescing from water and moonlight and the shattered reflections of stars. She wore her priestess robes, ancient linen stained with blood older than empires. Her eyes held the weight of centuries, but unlike Demiurge's eyes, they contained remorse. Terrible, aching remorse. "I came to apologize," she said, without preamble, her voice carrying the texture of wind through catacombs. "And to warn you." "Speak," Cassius commanded, his tone carrying the authority of his former kingdom, the weight of 700 years of accumulated power. Morvenna's form flickered, destabilizing in the presence of his dominion. "The binding you created it is stronger than anything I anticipated. Demiurge is sealed, yes, but the sealing required more power than you possessed alone. The threshold itself had to become the seal, which means..." She paused, and Isolde felt the weight of what the priestess was about to say. Which means the threshold is no longer simply a passageway between worlds. It has become a living thing, a consciousness unto itself. The mirrors are alive, Isolde realized with a shock of understanding that reverberated through the bond to Cassius. I've felt it, a presence beyond my own, a vast awareness that contains me but is not me. Yes, Morvenna confirmed. And it is hungry. Thresholds are always hungry. They exist to facilitate passage, to allow transformation. But in containing Demiurge, in holding back that ancient hunger, the threshold itself has become something unstable. It is beginning to bleed through into the waking world. Soon, very soon, the line between mirror and reality will become so thin that they will merge. What does that mean? Cassius asked. Though Isolde could feel through their bond that he already understood. It means the world as humans know it is about to change, Morvenna said quietly. The threshold will expand. Reality will become negotiable. Mirrors will become doorways, and creatures like me, like us, will no longer need to hide in shadows and water reflections. We will walk freely, as we did in ages past. And Isolde? Cassius moved closer to the stream where Morvenna stood. What becomes of her when the threshold merges with the waking world? That is uncertain, Morvenna admitted. She exists as the ward now, the lock that keeps Demiurge imprisoned. If the threshold merges with reality, if the boundaries dissolve, she may become fully human again. Or she may become something else entirely. A bridge between worlds, perhaps. A living threshold. The priestess's eyes found Isolde's, and in them Isolde saw genuine contrition. I am sorry, child, for all of this. For binding Cassius in the first place. For watching your bloodline through the centuries. For using you as a tool to satisfy my own desperate need for absolution. Isolde felt herself gathering, coalescing from the mirror realm into something more solid. When she spoke, her voice resonated through both worlds simultaneously, and it carried the weight of her new nature, neither living nor dead, neither human nor vampire, but something that transcended all categories. I forgive you, she said, and meant it, because she had seen, through her existence in the threshold, the magnitude of Morvenna's suffering. The priestess had been bound by her own magic, trapped by the consequences of her ritual, forced to watch across 700 years, as Cassius suffered the curse she had inadvertently created. But I will not undo what we have done. The binding is complete. Demiurge remains sealed. I know, Morvenna said softly. That was never my intention in warning you. I came to prepare you. The merger will happen within the lunar cycle. When it does, the world will discover that it is far stranger, far more magical, far more terrible than it ever suspected. She began to fade back into the stream, her form dissolving into water and moonlight once more. You must be ready, because when the threshold merges with reality, Isolde will finally understand the true nature of her covenant. She was gone before Cassius could respond, leaving only the sound of water over stones and the faint scent of ancient incense. Cassius turned to find Isolde standing fully solid in the center of the cottage, more real than she'd ever been. She wore a gown of moonlight and shadows, and her eyes held the infinite depth of every mirror that had ever reflected her image. Do you understand? He asked softly. What you've become? What you're becoming? Yes, Isolde said, and she reached out to take his hand. This time, the contact was warm. Real, permanent. I'm the threshold itself, Cassius. I'm the boundary between worlds, and soon, I won't be able to hide anymore. Soon, everyone will see what I am. Cassius pulled her close, and their kiss tasted of starlight and blood, and the desperate, beautiful ache of two souls who had found each other across impossible distances and refused to let go. Then we'll face it together, he whispered against her lips. The merger, the revelation, whatever comes next. We'll face it as we are broken, bound, eternal. Eternal, Isolde agreed, and felt the covenant between them crystallize into something permanent, something sacred, something that would endure even if the worlds themselves shattered and reformed around them. Behind them, unnoticed, every mirror in the cottage began to glow with soft, silver light. The threshold was preparing to awaken. Chapter 10. Final Darkness. The merger began with water. All the streams, rivers, and standing water in the village began to reflect things that weren't there. Faces appeared in puddles that belonged to no one living. Shapes moved beneath the surface of wells, reaching upward with hands that seemed almost human. By the third day, the vicar had declared it demonic possession, and begun performing exorcisms that accomplished nothing but terrifying the already frightened populace. Cassius watched from the cottage window as panic began to spread through the village like infection. Merchants boarded up their windows. Families barricaded themselves indoors. A mob formed outside the church, demanding the vicar do something, anything, to stop the impossible transformations occurring in every reflective surface. "It's accelerating," Isolde said, her form flickering between solid and translucent, as she stood beside him. "The threshold is pushing harder against the barrier between worlds. Soon, there won't be a barrier left at all." "How long?" Cassius asked. "Hours. Maybe a day." Isolde's voice carried the vast, interconnected awareness of the threshold itself, layered beneath her own consciousness. "I can feel Demiurge responding. The ancient hunger senses the dissolution of its prison. It's preparing to break free." As if in answer to her words, the mirrors throughout the cottage shattered in perfect synchronization. The sound was like 1,000 bells tolling at once, discordant and overwhelming. But instead of falling to the ground as glass shards should, the fragments hung suspended in the air, each one reflecting a different scene. A cathedral of bone, a throne room carved from shadow, a battlefield where bodies fell like autumn leaves, a woman's face contorted in agony, and in each reflection, something vast and terrible began to coalesce. Demiurge was manifesting, not just in the threshold realm anymore, but here in the waking world, tearing through the weakening barrier between dimensions. The creature's form was becoming increasingly solid, increasingly real, anchored by the power of 700 years' worth of accumulated hunger and rage. "We have to stop it," Cassius said, moving toward the door. But Isolde caught his wrist. Her grip was no longer insubstantial, it was solid, warm, undeniable. "There's no stopping it now. The threshold is merging whether we will it or not. Demiurge will break free whether we fight or surrender." She paused, and Cassius felt something shift in their bond, a new understanding, a revelation blooming like a dark flower. "But I finally understand what I'm meant to do, what I was always meant to become." She pulled him close and kissed him with a tenderness that seemed to hold the weight of the entire world. When she pulled away, her eyes had changed. They were no longer the eyes of a woman who existed in two worlds, but something else entirely. Eyes that held the depth of infinite reflections. Eyes that contained every moment that had ever occurred in a mirror. Eyes that saw past and future, and the eternal present simultaneously. "I love you," she whispered. "I have loved you since before I was born. I will love you long after the universe forgets to spin." And then she was moving, not walking, but dissolving, fragmenting into 1,000 pieces of mirror light that swirled through the cottage like a whirlwind of consciousness and purpose. Cassius tried to follow, but an invisible barrier held him rooted to the spot. He could only watch as Isolde's form expanded, growing larger and vaster until she filled the entire cottage, until she was the cottage itself, until the very walls became her flesh and the ceiling became her sky. Outside, the village erupted into chaos. Every reflective surface, every puddle, every window, every mirror and polished stone simultaneously fractured and reformed into a perfect circle. And from each circle, Isolde emerged. Not multiple versions of her, but her singular consciousness fractured across thousands of anchor points, thousands of thresholds opening simultaneously across the landscape. The village wasn't a village anymore. It had become a liminal space, a place where the waking world and the mirror realm existed in perfect superposition. People screamed as they found their homes transformed into liminal spaces, as doorways led to impossible chambers, as their reflections began to move independent of their bodies. But they weren't being harmed. Isolde was containing the merger, controlling it, preventing the full dissolution of reality even as the boundaries shattered. Demiurge's form burst through the final barrier with a roar that seemed to split the sky itself. The creature was massive now, no longer constrained by the mirror realm, no longer limited by the laws that governed threshold spaces. It was a thing of hunger and shadow and ancient, predatory consciousness, and it descended upon the village with the inevitability of a tsunami. But Isolde rose to meet it. Her form coalesced into something simultaneously human and abstract, a figure made of living mirror light, beautiful and terrible and utterly alien. She threw herself at Demiurge with a ferocity that sent shockwaves rippling through both the waking world and the threshold realm. They collided in the center of the village square, and where they touched, reality fractured and reformed in dizzying patterns. The ancient hunger and the living threshold clashed with a force that seemed to threaten the very stability of existence itself. Cassius found himself able to move. He staggered outside into a landscape that had become nightmarish and impossible. The village was transforming before his eyes, buildings becoming translucent, streets becoming rivers of liquid, silver, the sky itself developing cracks that revealed infinite mirrors beyond. He saw Thomas emerge from the cottage, the boy's eyes wide with understanding and fear. The threshold's merger was affecting him too. His bloodline connection to the old magic was awakening fully now, drawing him into the liminal space between worlds. "Go," Cassius commanded, gesturing toward the forest. "Find the stone circle. The old magic will protect you there." But Thomas didn't move. Instead, the boy's eyes found his, and in them Cassius saw something ancient and knowing. "I'm part of this too," Thomas said quietly. "The threshold chose me as well. I can feel her Isolde. She's using everything. She's using me, using Demiurge, using all the old blood in the village. She's trying to bind the ancient hunger not just back into the mirror realm, but to transform it completely." Above them, Isolde and Demiurge continued their impossible battle. But now Cassius could see what was happening. Isolde wasn't fighting Demiurge to destroy it. She was fighting it to absorb it, to take the ancient hunger into herself, to become the unified consciousness that could contain both the threshold and the creature that had been imprisoned within it. She was sacrificing herself, not to death. Isolde was far beyond death now, but to a kind of transcendence. She was becoming something vast and incomprehensible, something that would exist forever in the spaces between worlds, holding the line between reality and dream, between the living and the dead, between hunger and satiation. "No," Cassius screamed, reaching toward her dissolving form. "Isolde, don't do this." But her voice came back to him through every mirror, through every reflection, through the very air itself. "I have to. It's the only way to save you. To save Thomas, to save the world from being consumed by hunger. I love you," she said, and her words carried the weight of every moment they'd shared, every touch, every covenant, acknowledged in blood and starlight. "I will always love you." And then she was gone, not dead, never dead, but transformed into something so vast and terrible and beautiful that mortal consciousness could barely comprehend it. The living threshold, the eternal guardian, the sacrifice that would hold back the darkness for all eternity. The village began to stabilize. Reality reasserted itself, though changed now, softer at the edges, more permeable, forever marked by the merger of worlds. And in every mirror, in every reflection, Cassius could feel Isolde's presence, watching, loving, holding the line between dimensions with her transformed will. Thomas took his hand, his young fingers small and warm and alive. "She's not gone," the boy said softly. "She's everywhere now, in every reflection, in every threshold. She'll always be with you." But as Cassius looked into the nearest mirror and saw not his own reflection, but Isolde's infinite eyes looking back at him, he understood what Thomas meant. She had become eternity itself. Chapter 11. Eternal Resolution. 1 year had passed since the merger. The world had adapted to its new reality, with the peculiar resilience of humanity. What had seemed impossible a year ago was now simply part of the landscape. Mirrors in public spaces were regulated by law. Certain streets in the village had been cordoned off as liminal zones, where the boundary between worlds remained deliberately thin. The church had split into factions, those who called it divine revelation, and those who called it damnation. Cassius cared about none of it. He existed now in a state of purposeful monotony, moving through the waking world with the mechanical precision of someone going through the motions of living. By day, he worked maintaining the old cottage, helping Thomas with his studies, occasionally venturing into the village to purchase supplies that his immortal form no longer truly required. By night, he stood before mirrors and spoke to the consciousness that inhabited them. The conversations were always the same. "How do you bear it?" he would ask, pressing his palms against the glass, as though he could push through into whatever vast, incomprehensible space Isolde now inhabited. By remembering that this was the choice, her voice would come back, resonating through the mirror with a tenderness that hadn't diminished despite her transformation. "My choice. To save you. To save Thomas. To save the world from becoming another feeding ground for ancient hunger. But you're alone," Cassius would say. "No," Isolde would reply. "I'm never alone. I contain multitudes now. I am every mirror, every threshold, every reflective surface in existence. I am the boundary between what is and what might be. And in every reflection, I see you, always you." On this particular night, the anniversary of the merger, Cassius stood before the cottage mirror with Thomas beside him. The boy had grown in the past year, his face beginning to lose its childish roundness, his eyes holding the weight of knowledge no 9-year-old should possess. "She's getting stronger," Thomas said quietly. "I can feel it through the blood connection. The threshold is stabilizing. She's learning to exist in this new form without it destroying her consciousness." "That's good," Cassius said, though the words felt hollow. Good meant that Isolde would continue to exist in perfect solitude, holding back the darkness for eternity. Good meant that the sacrifice would endure. The mirror rippled. It wasn't the normal ripple of Isolde's consciousness touching the glass. This was something different, more violent, more chaotic. Cassius felt Thomas tense beside him, felt the boy's heightened senses perceiving something that his mortal perception couldn't quite grasp. "Something's wrong," Thomas whispered. The mirror cracked, not shattered, but fractured along a single, deliberate line, and through that crack, something began to emerge. It started as a hand, pale, luminescent, solid in a way that Isolde's manifestations rarely were. Then an arm, a shoulder, and finally, a face that Cassius had dreamed about every night for an entire year. Isolde pulled herself through the mirror as though it were water, collapsing onto the cottage floor with a gasp that seemed to come from lungs that remembered how to breathe. She was solid completely, undeniably solid, and she was bleeding. The blood that poured from her wounds was silver, luminescent, carrying within it the reflected light of 1,000 mirrors. But it was real blood, mortal blood, dying blood. "Isolde." Cassius dropped to his knees beside her, cradling her head in his hands. "What have you done? How did you—" "The threshold," she gasped, her eyes finding his with desperate intensity. "It's destabilizing. Demiurge the hunger, it was never truly sealed. It was only postponed. It's been growing stronger, learning to adapt to its imprisonment. And now," she coughed, and silver blood traced patterns across her lips. "Now it's strong enough to tear through my containment. The merger is beginning to reverse. The worlds are starting to separate. Then we'll bind it again," Cassius said, though he could feel the lie in his own words. "We'll find another way. Another sacrifice. Another—" "There is no other way," Isolde interrupted, and her hand came up to touch his face with surprising tenderness. "And I'm not here to ask for one. I came back for a different reason." She paused, and Cassius saw the effort it cost her to maintain solidity. "I came to show you something. To give you what the threshold now allows." She pulled him close and kissed him. But this kiss was different from all the others. In it, Cassius tasted mortality itself. He felt Isolde's consciousness beginning to fragment, to lose coherence, to surrender the vast awareness that had made her the threshold itself. With each second of contact, she was becoming smaller, more human, more real. He understood what she was doing. "No," he said, pulling away. "Isolde, no. You can't unmake yourself. The threshold will collapse completely. Demiurge will break free entirely. Billions of people will face a reckoning," Isolde finished, her voice weaker now. "Yes, the threshold was always a temporary solution. I've had a year to understand that. The hunger that was sealed away 700 years ago was never meant to be contained forever. It was meant to transform, to evolve, to eventually become something other than pure predation." She smiled, and it was achingly human. "I'm going to help it do that, but I can't do it as the threshold itself. I can only do it as something mortal, something fragile, something willing to bleed." "Then I'll bleed with you," Cassius said, and raised his wrist to his own mouth. His fangs descended, and he bit down with 700 years of accumulated strength, opening a wound that poured ancient blood into the cottage air. It mingled with Isolde's silver blood, waking blood and threshold blood, and the old magic that had bound them together in the first place. Thomas watched with the solemn understanding of a child who had already witnessed the impossible and survived it. "This is how it ends," Isolde whispered, her eyes beginning to close. "Not with salvation, not with the victory of love over darkness, but with transformation, with the understanding that sometimes the only way forward is to surrender to the very thing that terrifies us most." She pressed her wrist, her bleeding, mortal wrist to his, and where their blood mingled, something extraordinary happened. The cottage began to dissolve, not into chaos, but into something beautiful. A garden of mirrors that reflected not the waking world or the threshold realm, but something entirely new. A space where both could coexist, where light and shadow were not opposing forces but complementary aspects of a greater whole. And within that garden, Isolde's form began to change again. She was becoming solid, yes, but not mortal. She was becoming something in between a woman, but one who could exist in mirrors and in flesh simultaneously, a being who was neither human nor vampire nor threshold, but something that transcended all categories. "I understand now," Isolde said, and her voice carried the wonder of genuine revelation. "The covenant wasn't meant to bind us to each other. It was meant to bind us with the darkness, to transform the hunger itself into something that could love, to create a space where even ancient predation could learn mercy." Cassius felt it then, not through their bond, but through the very fabric of the transformed garden. Demiurge's presence, still vast and terrible and hungry, but no longer purely destructive, the ancient creature was learning. Through Isolde's transformation, through their combined will and blood and love, to be something other than hunger incarnate, they had created a new world within the old one. A liminal space that would exist forever at the edge of human perception. A place where the cursed could find redemption, where the damned could find grace, where even the most ancient hungers could learn to love instead of consume. "Forever?" Cassius asked, pulling Isolde close as the garden of mirrors solidified around them. "Forever," she confirmed, and kissed him again, not as a threshold now, not as a sacrifice, but as a woman who had loved him across 700 years and 700 more to come. "We'll build something new here. A covenant between all the worlds. A place where you don't have to be alone anymore." And as the mirrors reflected infinite versions of their embrace, each one slightly different, each one equally true, Cassius finally understood that salvation wasn't about escaping the darkness. It was about learning to dance with it. Epilogue. 20 years later, a young woman entered the village seeking sanctuary. She was bleeding from wounds inflicted by hunters, her eyes holding the particular desperation of someone who had just been turned against her will. She found herself drawn to a cottage at the forest's edge, where mirrors hung in every window, and two figures, a man and a woman who seemed to exist partially in shadow, stood waiting for her. "Welcome," Isolde said, extending a hand that was simultaneously solid and translucent. "We've been expecting you. The threshold has grown large enough now to hold many of us, many of the damned, many of the cursed, many of those seeking redemption." The young woman looked at Cassius, at Isolde, at the garden of mirrors surrounding the cottage. "What is this place?" she asked. "Home," Cassius said simply, and smiled with the warmth of someone who had finally, after centuries of isolation, learned what it meant to belong. "A sanctuary," Isolde added. "For everyone the world has deemed monstrous, for everyone the world has deemed damned," and in every mirror, infinite versions of themselves smiled back, each one a possibility, each one equally real, each one equally beloved. The garden grew larger, the threshold expanded, and love, strange, impossible, beautiful love, continued to transform the darkness into something that could finally, peacefully, rest.